This is the Creative Life Show, celebrating being highly creative in a less creative world. I'm Joanna Peters, coach and mentor to professional creatives and creative professionals. And I talk to other creatives, innovators and thinkers about how we create, face down our critics, stay on track, get noticed and paid, and do the work we want to do. And I'm sharing the progress of my own book, all about creative people and how we thrive. Hello and welcome. It's the week of the 9th of October, and the big news is that the Creative Life Show is now on Spotify. Now, obviously, if you're listening now, you've already found it. So Spotify might be another place for you to listen. But if you're one of the many listeners who's joined us on Spotify in the last few days, a particular welcome to you. So do hit the follow button on Spotify to get every new episode, and come over to creativelifeshow.com, where if you leave me your name and address, I will let you know when every new episode is out, alongside other resources and stories about creativity and creative work. So for the rest of this year, the Creative Life Show is going to be fortnightly, every 2 weeks on a Tuesday. One of my creative highlights in the last fortnight has been my first virtual reality experience. And maybe I'm quite late to this. It was at the opening of an exhibition of a group of artists in London, curated by the artist Alex Hinks. He collaborated with the virtual reality expert Ollie Lane. So you go in and you get a headset and controllers, and you can see you're facing one of Alex's paintings. And then you step forwards and it's literally like stepping into it. I could look right around 360 degrees, up, down. It was like being in this vast, beautifully lit cavern that seemed to go on forever. I could have stayed in there for hours. I absolutely loved it. So I wonder, should I get a virtual reality creative on the show? Let me know what you think. For my writing, I've also been experimenting with a new work pattern. So for the last few days, I've been doing the school run. But rather than coming back to my desk, I've been going onto a local cafe and just making myself work on my book without any distractions. It's been really interesting, and I've got more done, I think, doing it that way. So I'm going to try that every morning when I don't have a client or another meeting. First thing, I'll let you know how it goes. In today's episode, we also get into the question of habits. Kathryn Nicolai has an astonishing success story from not even thinking of herself as a creative to a story-based podcast that's had a phenomenal first series. Kathryn's embracing of her identity as a writer is something I really loved talking to her about. So get ready to be both calmed and inspired. Hello, welcome. My guest today calls herself an architect of cozy. Kathryn Nicolai is a yoga teacher and creator of a podcast called Nothing Much Happens, Bedtime Stories for Grown-Ups. She launched it early this year, and within 13 episodes, it had been downloaded or listened to over 1 million times. It's a crazy number for any new podcast, let alone a small, independent one like Kathryn's. So, Kathryn, welcome to the Creative Life Show. It's an amazing story.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really proud of it.
With this small indie creative project completely takes off. When did you know you'd created something that had really touched a nerve with people?
You know, it might have been within maybe even the first 2 weeks, because I remember standing in my kitchen one morning, and I was actually on Apple Podcasts looking for a new podcast for myself. And so I'm scrolling through the new and noteworthy section, just ho-hum. I wonder if there's anything new I want to listen to. And there was my podcast. And I just about dropped my phone in the sink and, and really lost it, because you know, I had this vision for this idea of what I wanted to create. And I thought, I'll make it. And I'll be proud of myself that I had a creative idea and I saw it out to the end. And my friends will very kindly download it, and then that will be it. But right after that, you know, I started getting messages from people all over the world. My downloads just kept building and building and building. And I realized there's a big need for this, and that I was being able to create something that was speaking to that need.
We'll talk a lot more about that in a moment. But first of all, the question I always ask all my guests, what does it mean to you to lead a creative life?
It's an interesting question, because the funny thing is I've never considered myself to be a creative person. I feel like I've always had a little bit of artist envy, sort of watching artists from the outside and wondering, how did you do that? How did you make that? So I feel like stepping out and doing this podcast was sort of the first movement for me to go, no, I'm declaring myself an artist. And so I'm not sure that I've given it ever much thought what it means to live creatively. Although now that I'm writing, regularly, today was my writing day, so I wrote all morning. I realized there are things that as an artist, I must do regularly to feed that input source for creativity to stay inspired. But before this, I would say, I don't know, you'll have to ask an artist.
That's wonderful. That's revealed that for you. So, perhaps you could just briefly explain what the podcast is. It's very simple, isn't it?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it is really. And the idea is just, it's a very busy, crazy world, maybe even more than it ever has before. I think we're probably all feeling that. And for a lot of people, they'll lay in bed at night and scroll through their phones and read really upsetting news and watch people be nasty to each other in the comments, and then try to shut that off and go to sleep. And I don't think that there's no direct pathway there. And I've always told myself bedtime stories. It's one of my earliest memories. I think I was about 4 years old, and I was telling myself a bedtime story to fall asleep. So I've always used this technique of creating some cozy, safe place to put my mind in order for everything to shut down. So I'd been working on that for a while, and then I decided to make it a podcast. So the podcast basically just walks you through the basic concept. It kind of explains how it's going to work. I tell you to turn off your phone and turn off your light and get cozy. And then I read the story, which takes about 10 or 12 minutes. I read it twice, which was really helpful because even though nothing happens in the story, which is why it's called Nothing Much Happens, people still want to hear it. They want to know what happens at the end, even though nothing happens. So knowing that it's going to happen twice gives you permission to relax. And a lot of people tell me they fall asleep as I begin the second reading, although it's a kind of brain training. So every time you listen, people tell me that they fall asleep sooner and sooner. Sometimes people tell me they fall asleep as soon as I say my name, which is about 15 seconds in.
Which is just this wonderful concept, the idea you create something that sends people to sleep.
It's a really joyful place for me to be, especially as that being part of my work as a yoga teacher is to help use my voice and my storytelling to help people relax. When I always think there probably aren't that many writers who get really excited when people fall asleep to their work, but I absolutely do.
So I'm fascinated by this idea of you telling stories to yourself as a 4-year-old. Were they the kind of stories that you're telling in the podcast?
No, they were more, if you think of sort of like a Gothic novel where everything goes terribly wrong and then comes wonderfully right. That was more the story that attracted me when I was 4 years old. But it was definitely about arriving at the place where everything did go right and feeling really safe and secure and calm. And I grew up in Flint, Michigan in the 1980s, and that definitely was not a calm, secure, safe place to grow up. So I wonder sometimes if it was a bit adaptive, that my mind was looking for a way to tuck myself to bed at night. And it said, well, we might not work with the reality of our lives right now. Let's go for a story.
And was that something you were still doing as an adult?
Yeah, I've always done it. And sometimes it would just be a real small idea, something really small like turning the lock on the door and knowing that you were safe inside your house and that you weren't going to leave again. And I could just think about turning the lock and it would put me right to sleep. And I'd wake up, if I woke up in the middle of the night, I'd turn the lock and I'd go right back to sleep.
And that's the heart of your first story on the podcast, isn't it?
Yes,
About you walking down, I think it's October Street and coming home, turning the locks and going to sleep on the sofa with the cat.
Yep. Nothing too special, but it's just that feeling of it's been a long day and I'm home now and I'm safe and I can relax.
So turning a story that's in your mind like that, telling it for yourself, it strikes me it must be quite a different thing to actually give it written form and actually turn it into very precise words and a story that you can read. Did you find yourself stretching yourself to do that?
Definitely. The process of then creating lots and lots of stories out of very general ideas was one that I wasn't really sure how it was going to come out. Those first several stories, I had them pretty much in my head, although a lot of the details were missing or the language wasn't there. As I moved through the first season, I needed a lot more stories because often I can tell myself the same. It's a bit like a little kid likes to be read the same book over and over again and watch the same movie 1,000 times. I can tell myself the same details, but I wanted to create more stories for my listeners. So oftentimes I'd be tucking myself in for bed at night, and I'd say to my wife, research and development. and I would try to come up with some new ideas or concepts. But I also found myself, just when I was out in the world, just constantly looking for what made me feel relaxed and grounded and cozy. And I noticed that when I started looking, I found things everywhere.
It strikes me as they're very much mindfulness in story form. They're very precise, very detailed, very, very sort of sensual and textured. You're talking about the texture of a velvet curtain or the feel of the door handle.
Yeah.
It's very emotive, very much of that paying attention to the tiny things.
To me, that's where it's at, being able to feel all the little sensory components. And, that's part of my training as a yoga teacher is, to be able to expand mindfulness. Now you're looking for, how does it feel? Is there a taste on your tongue? Can I feel the weight of my shirt on my back? Every slight sensation is a way to tie me into the present. And when I'm present, I'm naturally calm.
And I'm guessing it's that calmness that allows us to sleep by calming our minds in that way.
Definitely. And I think also, the mind just races. It's just the nature of the human mind. And if we don't have someplace to put it, it'll just race all night. And you've probably even had that experience where you're laying in bed reading a book and maybe not at all in a comfortable position, maybe crunched up in a really uncomfortable position, but you cannot keep your eyes open, where you keep dropping the book and you think to yourself, that's enough, put it down and go to sleep. And then you get as comfortable as you could possibly get and you can't sleep. Because as your mind was following along with the story of the book, it became this sort of lullaby for the thinking mind, and everything behind the scenes was shutting down. But as soon as you took that lullaby away, then the mind started to fill in with some details, and that's when we start to get revved back up. So I think, when people can just listen to the story, they're letting their mind follow along with me, and that way I can ease them right into sleep.
So when you launched, you said that it was a little creative project, you thought maybe family and friends. Did you already have some kind of mailing list or social media presence?
Not really, no. Just my own personal Facebook page and what I have for my yoga studio.
And did you send it out to other people, perhaps in the sleep world or other things, or was it really completely organic?
Pretty much completely organic. I've sent it out a couple times to, other people who I think would enjoy it, but they've rarely shared it in a way that I would account for the kind of following I have right now. So I think it's more likely that I listen to it and it works for me and I tell my friend and she listens and so on. It goes like that.
And I'm guessing people listening and listening and listening again themselves.
Yes, definitely. My second season comes out on Monday, October 8th. And so I got a note this morning that says, I know every single word of the first season. I'm ready for season 2. So definitely they're listening over and over again.
Which is an amazing thing. Again, generally we don't think of podcasts as a one listen only. It's an extraordinary thing you've created.
I know. I had no idea it was coming.
You've got quite an active social media presence now, it seems, particularly on Instagram, where it looks this beautifully curated feed of photographs and images and commentary. Yeah. Was that part of your podcast plan, or did you start doing that when you realized you were getting a following?
Exactly. I realized we were getting a following, and I'd been sort of keeping a Pinterest page of pictures and drawings, illustrations that would inspire me when it would come time to write. And I thought, well, I'll just start sharing these. But now I think my listeners and followers expect to see a new picture every day. And it's an interesting way for me to also be able to tie in to share some poetry or share someone else's work sometimes. It's a way that I communicate with a lot of my followers. I get messages every day from people who tell me they haven't slept in 5 years, or they've been through trauma, or they have anxiety attacks, and the podcast lets them calm down. So it's really, really satisfying.
You've done 13 episodes. Did you start out planning to do it effectively in a season, or did you reach the point you just needed to have a break and sort of stock your batteries?
I knew it was going to be a season. I never ever thought there'd be a season 2, just because I thought, here's a plan. I'll go for 12. That's a reasonable number. I can create 12. And I'll know by the end of 12 if anybody cares. But I never thought, I just didn't know that there was going to be, this kind of reception for it. So now I have 13 more episodes coming up, and I plan 2 more seasons next year.
How has it felt going in for the second season? Obviously, the first one, you had in many ways no pressure on yourself, but now you've got this huge fan base all waiting, more of the same.
There has been a little anxiety there, and I was recording in my studio. Now I have a home studio, so I can record at my house, and I send it to my engineer. And so I'm used to having him with me the whole time and watching me, and he can give me feedback and stuff. And I said, Bob, I can't do this without you. I just had that second season nerves. But he gave me some feedback, and he said he'd already done a couple episodes, edited them. He said, listen to them and remind yourself that you know how to do this. And I do. So I'm actually really excited about season 2, because I have way more cold weather season stories than I do warm weather stories. So the fact that I started this in the spring, was a little bit tricky for me. So I already have the whole season planned out. I'm just excited to write them.
It sounds as though the recording part is perhaps more of an emotional challenge than the writing part.
It is. And they can be quite emotional for me to read. Sometimes I think just putting myself in the place of that mindset or that emotional space that I'm writing about can be quite emotional for me. And before I would record 4 or 5 episodes together in one day, and it was just a little bit too exhausting for me. But now I can record whenever I want to. So I usually just do 1 a week and kind of pace myself. But I remember my brother sent me a text a couple of weeks after I launched, and he said, why does your voice make me cry? And I said, I don't know, but I cry when I read them sometimes. And it's just that feeling of being in that really open, sort of vulnerable emotional space that it just opens the floodgates for me.
There's a photo of you recording, or a little YouTube video on your website. And it really struck me that the blinds are closed, the sort of sound things on the walls, but that you're recording in darkness. Is that how you do it?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a little bit light sensitive anyway, and I have a little bit of dyslexia. So a really low lit room is much easier for me to read in, but it's also absolutely about setting the mood. So even in the room I'm in right now, it used to be a dark room in my house. The previous owner was a photographer. So it's quite dark in here. I have a candle lit, and I just have one very low light, and that's how I record.
And you started off saying that you're realizing that there are habits you're having to nurture to keep your creativity going. Could you tell us something about that?
I definitely need to be outside pretty regularly, because so much of it to me is about, like you mentioned, the mindfulness, just taking time to notice something. And a lot of noticing the natural world puts me in that place of just wonder and curiosity. I also have to read a lot to be a good writer. So I read, sometimes I go back and reread old books that almost feel like guilty pleasures because I've read them so many times, but they put me in that mindset of sort of pure enjoyment or relaxation. I have to say no to certain things. I limit my reading of social media and the news and things because I can become so agitated, like sort of any human would be these days, that it's tricky for me to fall into that place. And I meditate and practice yoga, and that all keeps me sort of tuned up inside so that I can do the work I want to do.
I'm interested particularly about the reading and the cutting out of other reading that's not helpful. Was that something you were doing anyway, or has it been more of a side effect of what you're doing now?
I think I'd started doing that anyway, but now it feels like a real necessity. I remember even reading a book that a friend had recommended to me that was sort of one of these dystopian future books. And it was captivating. I couldn't barely put it down, but then I would try to fall asleep at night and I could not figure out a place to put my brain in order for my body to go to sleep. And, I just realized I can't read this stuff right now. Partially because it feels sort of too close. All my good friends keep saying, have you seen The Handmaid's Tale? And I keep saying, I'm sure it's amazing, but I can't handle it right now. It's too close to home. So there are definitely some writers, some books that I just have to step away from.
I'm getting a sense that this has become a really important part of your life.
It definitely has. It's something I think about every day, the people that are listening and how I might be able to help them or give them a good night's sleep. And it's definitely awakened a part of myself that I didn't really think I had, which was this essence of creativity and capacity to be an artist.
What does that feel like?
A relief. Like I've been waiting for it for a long time. I grew up doing a lot of community theater from the time I was a little kid up into college. And, a lot of my friends were artists and painters and musicians. And I think I felt a little bit like a poser, allowed to hang out with them, but not without that much to contribute on my own right. And I feel like a big part of discovering or developing this creative part of myself is letting go of the idea of it being perfect or it being wonderful. I'm such a voracious reader and I have so much respect for great writing that sometimes I would think, don't write because it's not going to be as good as so-and-so. It's not going to be like you would want it to be. And I feel like part of maybe getting a little bit older too is embracing a little of your own mediocrity and going, it's not going to be perfect. No, but that doesn't mean that I can't create something. I feel like it's a relief now. I find a lot of joy in writing, and it seems a shame I've kept it out of my life for so long out of fear that it wouldn't measure up. I think when you get older, you realize it doesn't have to.
When you're writing, do you experience that self-doubt and questioning?
A little bit, I do. I mean, this will sound kind of silly, but I do remind myself, very few people will hear it. They fall asleep right away. Sometimes I'll be sort of agonizing over a word, especially if it's in the second half of the story or so. And I'll think, relax, Kathryn, no one will hear this. But I also just realize, I feel sort of that getting out of your own way sense of, I've written a lot of stories I'm very happy with. There's no reason to think I can't write more. So I usually, like today, I was writing a story and I did sort of get in my head and start doubting myself. And so I just keep writing. I give myself permission to just write nonsense for a little while, write a few more paragraphs that don't make any sense. Doesn't all have to come out cleanly right now. And then by the end of the afternoon, I had put together a story I was really happy with. I cut a lot of stuff out of it. But I think, that idea of just keep typing.
Do you start off with an idea of where it's going?
Pretty much. I always have sort of an outline, a title and an outline, major points that I want to hit or feelings that I want to evoke. But the fun thing is sort of finding something along the way that you didn't see coming. My new episodes haven't come out yet, but I just wrote one a couple of weeks ago where I thought it was going to be just about this sort of adult grown-up experience. And then I saw it through a child's eyes, and it brought this memory to the surface, and I wrote this whole different passage than I thought I was going to write. And it had a really sweet kind of feeling that I didn't expect.
And do you discover a different side of your stories when you're reading them out loud?
I think I'm thinking them out loud the whole time. I'm almost afraid to have anyone ever actually read my stories. I feel like they need to be delivered by me in my voice, and I'll show you how they should sound. So, no, I feel like I'm always thinking about how I'll say it when I'm ready to speak it.
But you don't dictate it?
No, I don't. I just can't think that far ahead. But I'm very audio centered. I have a condition called aphantasia, which means that I can't create, this might be surprising to some of my listeners, but I can't create visual images in my head. This is true for about 2 out of every 100 people or 50 people that, like, if I close my eyes, some people can, picture a beach, picture someone's face. I can't picture anything. There's no visual imagery inside my head. So I've always been really connected to audio. Even as a child, I remember listening to audiobooks and records over and over again because I think images don't stick with me very well.
So when you're describing something, such as the feel of a velvet curtain, you don't see it in your head. You're not describing what you can see. You're describing something else. What are you describing?
I guess I'm describing what I know. Like, it's a different way of thinking. And a lot of people who have aphantasia, they don't really know that other people can visualize things. Like, I didn't really realize we were being so literal. Even as a yoga teacher, where I might say, picture so-and-so, picture, the breath moving into the bottoms of your lungs. I didn't know that y'all were actually picturing it. I meant know the idea and feel the awareness inside your own consciousness. But there's no visual aspect to that in my experience.
That's fascinating. That's something that's new to me.
It is kind of a new thing that was really pinned down with some research just a few years ago. But I belong to a couple of groups for it. And the interesting thing is at least once or twice a week, a new member will sign on and say, I just found out that people can picture things. And because we kind of we never know what's going on in someone else's head. But we always tend to kind of think our experience must be like someone else's. And it's not.
So have you changed the way you relate to the way you see things by creating these stories, which are so descriptive?
I don't think so. I think this is always how my experience is. And part of that is probably from being a yoga teacher. And I teach yoga mostly with asking people to close their eyes. And so I'm constantly trying to describe to them, besides just moving their bodies, trying to tell them a story to bring them into a specific place. And it won't be so much a narrative as my stories are. But I realized that when I started to write, that my vocabulary was well trained. My capacity to explain things in a way that people could quickly connect to was trained from my occupation. So I don't think this is new. I think this is probably how I've always kind of experienced things.
That makes sense. I can hear that you're used to communicating in a way that's quite simple and straightforward.
But also meaning to be quite emotionally evocative, to be able to connect people to the emotion in a moment and to sort of, I always kind of feel like, as a yoga teacher, I don't want to be a competitive voice with the voice in your head. I want to find a way to go right up next to you and be sort of the buddy voice so that what I'm saying as your teacher, you just naturally going, oh, right, me too, rather than sort of my will against yours. So I feel like I've always kind of aligned my storytelling to be one that doesn't compete or push out someone else's experience, but instead feels so familiar that you just kind of claim it as your own.
That's a wonderful concept, particularly for writers, I think. I love the idea of not drowning out somebody's own voice, but being just complementary to it. Has your huge success with season 1 given you a new sense of direction or purpose with it? I'm sure it's also opening opportunities.
It certainly has, and that's a very exciting part of it. I think probably the biggest part is just a feeling of responsibility to my listeners. I get so many messages from people who they need more than a good night's sleep. They need to ease their minds and find something calm and steady for themselves. And so I do feel a sense of responsibility to, keep providing them with that soft place to land.
And you're developing, I think, other content you're using Patreon for your Patreon members and additional content. Is that something which you're planning to grow?
I think that's sort of still to be determined. I think it'll depend on sort of what happens in season 2, but it's something that I can very happily and readily create. I actually have a yoga podcast as well that isn't in sort of the public domain, but under a password on my website for mostly my own I honestly made it for my mom. I should say I made it for my mom because she moved away and she missed my yoga classes. And so I started recording live yoga classes for her. And now I have students all over the world who practice with me through that. So I feel like, for me to do guided meditations and things like that's just a natural extension. And if it's helpful to people, then I want to do it.
So the second series of Nothing Much Happens is, will probably have gone live by the time you're listening to this. Kathryn, where can people find it?
So it's sort of on all the major podcast apps. So definitely Apple Podcasts and Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. You can ask Alexa to play it for you, and she will. One of my friends texted me in the morning, and one morning, and she just said, I haven't been able to sleep, and I couldn't remember how to do the podcast thing, so I just called out in the middle of the night, Alexa, play Nothing Much Happens, and she did, and she said, and I fell asleep, and she said. She's texted me a couple of times and said, I have a story called 3 Good Things, focusing on sort of remembering some good things through the day. And she said, I've heard it 10 times and damned if I haven't even heard the second good thing. I said, maybe I'll make some cliff notes. And I have a Facebook page and an Instagram, all under Nothing Much Happens. And then I have a website, just sort of a landing page if people want to listen there. And that's nothingmuchhappens.com.
Fantastic. I will put all those on the Creative Life Show website at creativelifeshow.com. Kathryn, thank you so much for coming on. And I hope your second series is also a huge success.
I hope many people fall asleep to it.
Absolutely. And unless you're listening to this late at night, I hope it's inspired you to go out and follow a dream, a creative itch, and discover what's inside you. Unless, of course, you're also listening at night, when I hope this inspires the right kinds of dreams. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you back here very soon.